I still remember the metallic taste of fear in my mouth that April morning in 1944. They don't tell you in the history books about the day Americans fought Soviets over German skies. They don't mention it in the documentaries. Some things, I suppose, are too complicated, too messy for the neat narrative of the good war. But I was there. I saw it. And 60 years later, I can still hear the screams over the radio when we realized what we'd done. My name is Robert Bobby Kellerman, and this is the story they never wanted us to tell. It was April 11th, 1944. I was 22 years old, a B-17 pilot with the 392nd Bomb Group based out of Wendling, England. We called our fortress Memphis Belle Jr. Not very original, I know, but we were kids playing at war, and the original Memphis Belle had just completed her 25th mission. We figured the name might bring us luck. We'd need every ounce of it that day. The briefing room was thick with cigarette smoke when Captain Morrison pulled back the curtain on the big map. Our target was the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory at Sorau, deep in eastern Germany. It was what we called a maximum effort mission. Every plane that could fly would fly. The room went quiet. Sorau meant a long flight, heavy flak, and swarms of German fighters. It also meant we'd be flying close to the Eastern Front, where the Soviets were pushing west. "Gentlemen," Morrison said, tapping the map with his pointer, "you'll be flying in the company of heroes today. Soviet fighters have been cleared to escort our bombers through the final leg. Our Russian allies will provide cover while their ground forces are engaging the Germans below." A murmur went through the room. We'd heard about coordination with the Soviets, but this was the first time any of us would actually fly alongside them. My co-pilot, Jimmy Chen, a kid from San Francisco whose parents had to fight just to prove they weren't the enemy, leaned over and whispered, "Russians? Jesus, Bobby, half of them are probably flying planes held together with spit and prayers." I should have laughed. I didn't. Morrison continued with the technical details. Recognition signals. Radio frequencies. The Soviets would be flying Yak-9s and some American-supplied P-39 Airacobras. They'd meet us at a designated waypoint marked on our maps. Simple enough, or so we thought. War is never simple. We took off at 600 hours. 36 B-17s lumbering into the gray English dawn, each one carrying 10 men and 6,000 pounds of high explosives. I can still feel the vibration of those 4 Wright Cyclone engines thrumming through my bones. The formation came together slowly. Great silver birds finding their place in the sky like geese heading south. Our fighter escort, P-51 Mustangs from the 357th, took up positions above and to the sides. The flight across Europe was uneventful until we crossed into German airspace. That's when the flak started. Black puffs of smoke blossoming around us like deadly flowers, each one a shell that could tear a plane apart. You learn not to think about it. You focus on holding formation, on the instruments, on anything but the fact that you're sitting in an aluminum tube filled with gasoline and bombs while people on the ground try to kill you. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high." The call came from our top turret gunner, Sergeant Mike O'Reilly. German fighters. Focke-Wulf 190s, 4 of them, diving out of the sun. Our Mustangs broke formation to engage. The 50 caliber guns in our fortress opened up, the sound deafening even through our headsets. One of the German fighters broke through, cannon shells walking up the fuselage of a B-17 2 ships to our right. I watched it fall out of formation, smoke pouring from 2 engines, before I forced myself to look away. You can't help them. You can only keep flying. We pressed on. The Mustangs drove off the German fighters, but they'd return. They always did. As we approached the waypoint where we were supposed to meet our Soviet escort, I checked my watch. 14:20 hours. Right on time. Memphis Belle Jr. to little friends, do you have visual on our Russian allies? Negative, Memphis. Sky's clear except for us. I felt the first twinge of unease. Maybe they were late. Maybe they'd encountered their own problems. The Eastern Front was fluid, chaotic. I decided to hold course and wait. 10 minutes later, our waist gunner Tommy Kowalski called out, "Fighters at 3 o'clock. Looks like, hell, I can't tell what they are." I craned my neck to see. A formation of fighters was approaching from the east, sunlight glinting off their wings. They were single-engine, That much I could tell. As they got closer, I saw the distinctive inline engine cowling. They looked like P-39s, the era Cobras we'd sent to the Russians under Lend-Lease. "That's them," Jimmy said, relief in his voice. "Our Soviet friends." But something felt wrong. They were coming in too fast, and their formation was too aggressive. The lead fighter waggled its wings, a recognition signal, but it was sloppy, uncertain. Then I saw it. In the split second before everything went to hell, I saw the markings on the lead fighter's wings. Not the red star of the Soviet Air Force, the black cross of the Luftwaffe. "Those aren't Era Cobras," I screamed into the radio. "They're German. Italian fighters Mach 202s, break formation." But my warning came too late. The German fighters, cleverly disguised at distance to look like our expected Soviet escort, opened fire. Cannon shells tore through our formation. The B-17 ahead of us, Dakota Dream, took hits in both starboard engines. I saw propeller blades fly off, metal torn like paper. Our gunners returned fire, but we'd been caught flat-footed, expecting friends and finding enemies instead. The Mustangs dove to engage, but some of the German fighters had already broken through. And then, from the north, another formation appeared. These were definitely Soviet aircraft. I could see the red stars now, clear as day. Yak-9s, maybe 15 of them, flying in a tight defensive formation. They'd seen the German attack and were coming to help. "Thank God," Jimmy breathed. But in the chaos and confusion of the dogfight, in the smoke and the terror, and the split-second decisions that mean life or death, someone made a mistake. One of our Mustang pilots, Billy Crawford from Texas, I'd played cards with him 2 nights before, saw the Soviet fighters approaching the bomber formation. In the swirling madness of combat, with German fighters mixed in with our aircraft, with his adrenaline pumping and his finger on the trigger, he saw fighters diving toward our bombers. He didn't see the red stars. Or maybe he saw them, and in that moment of confusion, his mind didn't process what they meant. All he saw was fighters attacking his charges. Billy Crawford opened fire on the lead Soviet fighter. I saw the tracers arc across the sky. I saw the Soviet Yak shudder as bullets tore into its engine. The aircraft nosed over and began to spin, trailing black smoke. I watched helplessly as the Soviet pilot fought for control before finally bailing out, his white parachute blossoming against the dark smoke. "No, no, no!" I was screaming into the radio, but it was chaos. Everyone was shouting. The radio discipline we'd been trained to maintain had dissolved into a cacophony of warnings and curses and prayers. The other Soviet pilots saw their comrade go down. From their perspective, they'd come to help their American allies and had been fired upon. They must have thought we'd betrayed them. Or perhaps they thought we were Germans and captured American aircraft. Whatever they thought, their response was immediate. The Yaks broke formation and engaged our Mustangs. Americans and Soviets, allies in a war against fascism, began killing each other over the skies of Germany, while the actual enemy watched and waited for their chance. I pulled Memphis Bell Jr. into a hard bank, trying to get clear of the dogfight erupting around us. A Soviet Yak flashed past our nose, so close I could see the pilot's face. He looked young, younger than me, and terrified. He was firing at a Mustang, and the Mustang was firing back, and both of them were supposed to be on the same side. "Get us out of here, Bobby," Jimmy shouted, his voice cracking with panic. I was trying, but we were in the middle of a 3-way fight now. German fighters were picking off B-17s while American and Soviet fighters tangled with each other. Another of our bombers, Liberty Run, took fire from what looked like a German Focke-Wulf. But then I saw a Soviet Yak pursuing the German, firing desperately, trying to drive him off. The Soviet pilot was trying to protect us even as his comrades were fighting our escort. The whole situation was madness, a nightmare of miscommunication and split-second decisions made wrong. Every pilot up there was doing what they thought was right, what they'd been trained to do. Protect your formation. Engage the enemy. Trust your instincts. But when everyone's instincts are telling them different things, when friend and foe become impossible to distinguish in the smoke and the speed and the terror, training means nothing. A Soviet fighter locked onto one of our Mustangs, the pilot clearly determined to avenge his fallen comrade. I watched helplessly as the Yak's guns tore into the American fighter's tail section. The P-51 began to smoke, but stayed in the air, the pilot fighting for control. The Soviet lined up for another pass, and I knew the American pilot wouldn't survive it. Without thinking, I reached for the throat mic. Soviet fighter, break off, break off. We are allies, allies. I don't know if he heard me. I don't know if he would have understood my English even if he had. But something made that Soviet pilot hesitate. Maybe he got a better look at the markings on the Mustang. Maybe he remembered his briefing about American aircraft. Maybe he just had a moment of doubt that saved a life. The Yak pulled up and away. The damaged Mustang limped toward the west. And in that brief moment of clarity, I saw the situation for what it truly was. A tragedy born of confusion, where good men on the same side were killing each other while evil watched and profited. All aircraft, cease fire, cease fire. The voice on the radio was authoritative, cutting through the chaos. It was our mission commander, Colonel Davies, circling above the formation in his lead B-17. American fighters, disengage from Soviet aircraft immediately. Soviets are friendly. Repeat, Soviets are friendly. But Davies's order came seconds too late for at least 2 more pilots. I saw a Mustang and a Yak collide in midair, their wings clipping each other as they both tried to fire at the same German fighter. Both aircraft disintegrated in a cloud of debris. 4 parachutes deployed, 2 from each plane. They'd all survived the collision, but they'd be prisoners of the Germans within the hour. Prisoners because they'd been too busy fighting each other to see the real enemy. Slowly, agonizingly, the American and Soviet fighters began to break off from each other. The confusion started to clear. The Soviet pilots, disciplined despite the chaos, reformed their formation and began flying escort for our bombers, exactly as they'd been briefed to do. Our Mustang pilots, shaken and confused, took up their positions again. The Germans, seeing an organized defense reforming, broke off their attack and fled east. The entire incident, from Billy Crawford's first tragic shots to Colonel Davies's ceasefire order, had lasted less than 4 minutes. 4 minutes that felt like a lifetime. 4 minutes that killed at least 3 men and probably more. We continued to the target. What else could we do? We had a mission to complete. Men had already died for this mission. Americans, Soviets, and yes, Germans too. Turning back wouldn't bring them back. So we flew on, escorted by Soviet fighters who must have been wondering whether they should trust us, whether we might turn on them again. The bombing run over Sorau was textbook. Our bombs hit the factory complex, secondary explosions confirming good hits on the target. Anti-aircraft fire was heavy but inaccurate. We lost 1 more bomber on the run, but it went down to German flak, not to the madness of allies fighting each other. The Soviet fighters stayed with us all the way to the edge of their operational range, then waggled their wings in farewell and turned back east. I wondered what they were thinking. I wondered if they'd report what happened. I wondered if anyone would believe them if they did. The flight back to England was quiet. Our crew barely spoke except for the necessary radio calls. What was there to say? We'd just participated in something that should never have happened, something that called into question everything we thought we knew about this war. When we finally touched down at Wendling, the debriefing was unlike any I'd experienced. Intelligence officers grilled us for hours about exactly what we'd seen, what we'd done, who had fired first. Colonel Davies made it clear, in terms that left no room for interpretation, that this incident was to be classified. We were not to discuss it with anyone outside our immediate unit, not with other crews, not with ground personnel, certainly not in letters home. "Gentlemen," Davies said, his face haggard with exhaustion and something else, maybe shame, maybe sorrow. "What happened today was a tragedy born of the fog of war. Good men died because of confusion, because of split-second decisions made in impossible circumstances. But the alliance with the Soviet Union is critical to winning this war. If word of this incident spreads, if it's politicized or sensationalized, it could undermine that alliance. Do you understand what I'm saying?" We understood. The truth would be buried. filed away in some classified report that might not see the light of day for decades. The men who died would be listed as killed in action against German forces. Their families would never know the whole truth. History would never record what really happened that day. Billy Crawford, the Mustang pilot whose first shots had triggered the cascade of violence, ate his service pistol 3 weeks later. They said it was combat stress, and maybe it was. But I think Billy knew what he'd done, knew that he'd started something terrible even if he hadn't meant to, and he couldn't live with it. His death was ruled accidental. Another truth buried. In the decades since, I've thought a lot about that day, about the nature of alliances, about how quickly trust can dissolve into violence, about how thin the line is between friend and enemy when everyone's scared and nobody knows exactly what's happening. The Cold War that followed the war we thought was good sometimes seems like an inevitable extension of that April day in 1944, when Americans and Soviets shot at each other instead of at our common enemy. I've read the histories. I've watched the documentaries. They talk about American-Soviet cooperation during World War II as if it was simple, straightforward. Gallant allies united against fascism. They show pictures of American and Soviet soldiers embracing at the Elbe River in April 1945, when our armies finally met. What they don't show is what happened a year earlier, when we shot each other out of the sky because we were confused and scared and too ready to see enemies everywhere. We like our wars to have clear narratives, good guys versus bad guys. But war is confusion and chaos and split-second decisions that can't be taken back. It's good men doing terrible things for what seem like good reasons in the moment. It's alliances that are more fragile than we want to admit. It's truths that get buried because they're too complicated, too messy for the story we want to tell ourselves. I'm 84 years old now. Most of the men who were with me that day are gone. Jimmy Chen died in Korea. Mike O'Reilly made it home but drank himself to death by 50. Tommy Kowalski is in a nursing home in Pittsburgh. He doesn't remember much of anything anymore, and maybe that's a mercy. Colonel Davies passed away in 1998 without ever speaking publicly about what happened. The classified files from that day were finally declassified in 2005. 61 years after the fact. By then, nobody cared much. It was just another footnote in a war full of footnotes, lost in the larger narrative of victory. But I remember. I remember the face of that Soviet pilot as he flashed past our nose, so close I could see his terror. I remember watching Americans and Soviets kill each other while Germans watched and waited. I remember the silence on the flight home, the weight of what we'd been part of. I remember Billy Crawford's empty seat in the mess hall, and the way nobody would look at it. They say truth is the first casualty of war, but that's not quite right. Truth doesn't die in war. It just gets buried, filed away, classified until everyone who might be inconvenienced by it is safely dead. And maybe that's necessary. Maybe the alliance really was more important than the truth. Maybe those men really did die for something greater than themselves. Even if that something was the decision to pretend their deaths happened differently than they did. But I was there. I saw it, and I think the men who died that day, American, Soviet, and German alike, deserve to have their story told, even if it doesn't fit neatly into the narrative of the good war. They deserve to be remembered not just as names on a casualty list, but as real people who died in a moment of confusion and chaos that should never have happened. War is hell, they say. But sometimes the real hell is what comes after, when you have to live with what you've done, what you've seen, what you've been told to forget. The real hell is knowing the truth and being told it doesn't matter, that some larger purpose justifies the burial of that truth. I don't know if telling this story now does any good. The war has been over for 70 years. The Soviet Union doesn't even exist anymore. The men who fought that day are almost all gone, but I'm still here. And I remember, and I think that matters. I think bearing witness matters, even if it's bearing witness to something complicated and messy and impossible to fit into a neat narrative. That's what happened on April 11th, 1944, over the skies of Eastern Germany. Americans and Soviets, allies in theory, enemies for 4 terrible minutes in practice. Good men died because of confusion, because of fear, because in the chaos of war it's easy to shoot first and ask questions later. The truth was buried for decades, but the truth deserves to be told. Not because it changes anything, The war still ended the way it ended. The alliance held, barely. The world we live in now is the world that emerged from that conflict. But the men who died that day deserve to be remembered for what really happened, not for the sanitized version that fit better with the story we wanted to tell. I'm telling you this now because I'm old, and I won't be here much longer. And someone needs to remember. Someone needs to know that history is more complicated than the textbooks say, that alliances are fragile, that good men can do terrible things to each other when they're scared and confused, and that sometimes the fog of war is so thick that friend and enemy become impossible to distinguish. This is my testimony. This is my truth. Make of it what you will. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the complexity of war and alliance and truth, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and leave a comment below. These stories need to be told, even the uncomfortable ones. Especially the uncomfortable ones. Maybe especially the ones they tried to bury.